So I've been trying to practice what I preach a bit on everything that's going on in the country right now, particularly around the George Floyd case and the riots and the protests and the things that are going on. Trying to think and really understand what I don't know, take time to formulate opinions and views, not jump to conclusions, because I really do think that's the right way to handle almost anything complex. So I've been trying to do that. So I've been trying to listen a lot, talking to lots of different people, obviously watching news, watching live feeds of some of the protests, watching a lot of the speeches being given by public figures and protesters, a lot of the response by public officials and media outlets and just everyday people, family, friends, etc. From all different races, all different walks of life. And there's a lot, there's a lot to take in, as I'm sure you know, and as you would imagine. There's lots of different views, there's lots of different opinions, there's lots of complexity, there's lots of nuance to a lot of it. But I think in some ways at the root of the issue we're having right now, it really comes down to one simple topic, one simple point of contention, if you will. Putting it simply, you have two sides, as you often do. This has become politicized, no surprise, and I'm generalizing a bit, but by and large, you have people on the left who feel like the Black Lives Matter kind of beliefs of African American men in particular are being harassed and in some ways hunted by police, murdered unnecessarily, abused, just the things you hear, right? That this is a pervasive aspect of American culture and the American kind of system. And it's, stories like George Floyd pop up, but it's happening every day all around the country in different ways. It's a horrible thing and somewhat rare, somewhat when the person actually dies, but things like this are happening all the time. Right, that's kind of the view on the left. The view on the right, again, I'm generalizing a bunch here, and in doing this, it's not to try and simplify this. It's trying to, as I've said in other videos, just try and understand some of the themes in thinking. And there's certainly different, it's a spectrum. So there's people that sit on a certain part of the left, a certain part of the right. There's certain people that are just not rational actors or not morally good actors, right? You have that on all sides. So there's certainly those people. But if you tried to generalize the rational people on either side and kind of their views, that's the left. The right, is more or less saying like, hey, anytime somebody dies, that they shouldn't die. That's a horrible thing. And if a police officer kills somebody because of their race or does something inappropriate because of race, they should be punished, as they should be punished if they did it to anybody. And in this case of George Floyd, that police officer should absolutely be charged and put in front of a jury of his peers. But let's not overstate it. Let's not suggest it's something broader than it is if it's not. This idea that it's pervasive throughout the system and all that. That's really the crux of it. Do you believe, do you agree with how pervasive racism is in our country? Do you believe that for the average black man walking down the street, driving in his car, when he interacts with police, it's a roll of the dice. It's a roll of the dice of which cop he gets and what's going to happen in that moment. And I believe there's a fundamental difference in what the left believes the answer to that question is and what the right believes the answer to that question is. And it's interesting because, as with a lot of things, most of this topic there is agreement on, right? Starting with the most simplest part of it, what happened to George Floyd was horrific, should not have happened. And the person that did it needs to be held accountable and justice needs to be had. All reasonable people agree with that. I think most reasonable people agree that there's a lot of good cops out there, but there's some bad ones, right? I think most people agree with that that's something that exists. I think most people agree that there are some racist white people out there and racist black people for that matter. But not all of them. There's plenty of good ones, right? I think most people agree on that fact. So I think a lot of what's happened here, there's a lot of agreement. I think most people would agree that the looting and the violence is not helpful. It's counter to what's trying to be done. It may be understood, the anger might be understood, but I think most reasonable people would agree is it's got to stop, right? So all these things you see, there's agreement on. I think, again, the disagreement comes down to this one point. It's this where all of a sudden, and I see it in conversations all the time, where it starts to diverge as soon as this topic is introduced, that this is a pervasive problem. And it goes back to what we've talked about recently about, kind of this general theme of how liberals think and how conservatives think, where liberals think more about doing the right thing, to put it simply, and conservatives think more about doing it the right way, right? So this idea of, we care about people and we care about logic and we care about protecting what America is and the greatness of America. Both sides care about that. It's just slightly different for either one, right? And I think it plays out in this scenario too, just like it does with, should you wear a face mask? Should we open the economy? Immigration, right? All these things. The point of disagreement is around, do you take a leap of faith, which the left does a little more often, and say, listen, I don't need all the facts. I don't need all the data necessarily. I just know what it means to do the right thing and be a good person. And that's what you should err on, even if it means sometimes it's a little illogical or it's not exactly, the way it was set up or designed to be in America. And the right says, hey, I care about people too, but we have a system and we have a process for good reason, so we have to follow that. So you see that coming into play here, because you have this question of how pervasive is racism in America? How horrible is it for the average black man to walk the streets in America or interact with cops? And the two sides are taking their two approaches to that, right? The left, particularly those who haven't experienced it themselves, if they're not black, if they haven't been through it, but even if they are, they're saying, listen, I don't know the exact data and the exact stats. I can't give you necessarily concrete evidence of this. Certainly I could point to examples, right? People that have died and, the George Floyds of the world, et cetera. There's those. But to prove the point that it's as pervasive as they're saying, it's a hard thing to prove, right? There is certain data, but data can always be viewed different ways. And, percentage of, police brutality incidences or cops killing a person, is it more white people? It gets jumbled, right? And it's not a clear thing to prove. But what they're saying and what they say on their side is, I believe you. I believe you, black people, when you tell me this happens. I believe you're saying it for a reason. Is it always true? I'm sure it's not. I'm sure sometimes it's over dramatized or it's manipulated for different reasons. But in general, I believe you. I don't need to see the receipts in this case. I believe you. What the right is doing is saying, listen, I'm happy to believe you, right? And again, I'm taking the most reasonable people in these arguments. I'm happy to believe you if that is true. But the way I think is you need to prove it to me. I do need to see the receipts. I need to understand that this is real because I don't take actions on a whim. Sure, I see somebody get murdered by a cop on video. That person needs to be held accountable. But if you're going beyond that and saying there's a broader issue, sure, I'm sure there is to an extent, but you're trying to convince me that it's this overwhelming issue. Well, show me the data, show me the proof, show me where it is. And again, you start getting into this data and it's not always conclusive in the data. So the typical conservative is saying, listen, I don't see it. I don't see it. I don't see it. I don't see where it is. I believe that you believe that's happening, but when I look at the actual facts, I don't see it, right? And then there's all these little things that pick away at the story. There's these things like, well, what was happening, right? Was the person in the wrong place, in terms of, maybe they were committing some petty crime, or maybe they were intoxicated or on drugs, and all those things start to come into play, right? Did he have a criminal record? Not that should ever be a reason why somebody should be murdered or brutalized by the police, but it starts, if we're being completely objective, it does matter. It does matter in a situation where there's an arrest taking place. What's the context? Were they resisting at all? Did they have some history? What was the police called in for? Is the person intoxicated? It does matter. And to the typical conservative, it matters a ton because they're looking at the facts and the logic and just that, right? And again, you look on the left and they're saying, listen, he may have been drunk or he may not have in whatever situation we're talking about, but he was murdered, right? And it may happen in other instances, but it should never happen. It's just wrong. So take the leap of faith, err on the side of doing the right thing and help these people. And again, it's not that either side is purely evil or purely good, right? It's just they're looking at it through a different lens. And you get to this fundamental issue of the two sides do just not agree. They can't convince each other that this is a real problem or it isn't a real problem. So every time you get to that point of like, hey, how much change are we looking to affect here? It breaks down right there because they disagree on how much change is needed. So I don't have the answer to this yet. I've started pondering that. And if you take like a very scientific, data-driven approach, you test it, right? You create a control group somehow, if you could, within the data to say, hey, let's look at white people that get arrested for petty crimes, for doing different things, and what their interactions are like. And let's look what happens with African Americans. And that study may exist. I haven't done enough research on it yet, but it's probably a hard study to do. And you always have the issue of data and how people will interpret it. But somehow we need to get to more of an objective truth on this answer. We need to get to a place where both sides can agree somehow. And maybe it's data, maybe it's analysis, maybe it's something else. I don't know. Maybe, unfortunately, it needs to be seen more on video, so body cams are the answer. But somehow we need to bridge this divide of the two ways the sides think, particularly on this issue, because it's so important, so important.